interpretation button. Choose then English. Якщо у вас мобільний телефон, ви мусите знайти меню де інде.
If you are accessing us from the cell phone,
find your interpretation button from the menu. Окей. Якщо би переклад не працював, то, будь ласка,
in case if the interpretation does not work, please let us know in the chat.
Please write in the chat and let us know that you can't follow us. Окей. Іро, чи ми можемо почати тепер? Окей. Іра tells me that I can start. So I will start. My name is Павло Смицнюк. Мене звати Павло Смицнюк. Я директор Інституту Екуменічних студій. І я вітаю всіх вас на першій з наших трьох лекцій.
All of you at our first out of 3 lectures dedicated to international humanitarian law. I apologize again for technical glitches that postponed the beginning of our event. The project that we are currently starting is aiming at achieving 2 results. On the one hand, we would like to have a better understanding of Russian crimes. We would like to understand what is admissible and what is not admissible from the point of view of international humanitarian law in general, especially when it pertains to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. On the other hand, we would like to understand the legal demands and requirements that we are currently facing. The Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian combatants, everyone. We are supported by international community. The international community understands that the righteousness, the rightfulness, and the truth is on the side of Ukraine. And so that Ukraine continue to persevere on this side of right, we would like our society, our government, our social and religious organizations would be aware of the principles that the sides should stick to during this war.
Війну теж емоційно. Так, нам тяжко тримати нашу голову в холоді. Я сьогодні
Stay cool. Today I was watching the funeral of Artemy Demid, who is the son of the first rector of the Ukrainian Catholic University and our colleague and our former student of the Ukrainian Catholic University. And Father Mikhailo Demid, his father is our colleague at the Institute of Ecumenical Studies. He perished tragically in this war. And you cannot look at this in a cool way. You have heart, you have emotions, and you cannot stay cool, but still you have no choice. So we have to understand and look at this conflict from the standpoint of view of law, from the standpoint of view of international humanitarian law. And therefore, we have initiated with the backup of the Konrad Adenauer Fund, this series of 3 seminars that Professor Afonso Seixas Nunes will conduct for us. We are starting this non-public training. Some will be monitoring this violations of the international humanitarian law. And we conduct this monitoring together with the International Institute of Humanitarian Law in San Remo in Italy. If you would like to pass this training, please get in touch with Irena Kitura. So, in the following 3 lectures, our guide will be Afonso Seixas Nunes. I am glad that Alfonso agreed to be our lecturer. He is wearing 2 hats on his head at least. He is a philosopher, he is a theologian, he is a priest, he is a Jesuit who studied philosophy, theology in the Portugal Catholic University. in Raz, and then in the Papal Gregorian University. In other words, he can look at the world both as a theologian and as a pastor. But today he will be looking at the world and at our war as a lawyer. He studied law at Porto Losco in Portugal. He also studied at London School of Economics. He has a PhD from the University in Essex. I got acquainted with him while I was a student in Oxford. When I studied there, Afonso was a fellow of a scientific fellow of the Oxford Institute of Law and Military Conflict. Currently, Afonso is professor at the University of St. Louis in the United States, where he belongs to the Faculty of Law. In his PhD dissertation and later in his publications, he is focusing on the international humanitarian law and international public law. The focus of his scholarship is technologies, military technologies, in particular autonomous weapon, and the question of personal or national liability for what is being done with the use of autonomous weapon. This training will not pertain to this particular of his expertise, but if you are interested, maybe during the question and answer sessions, you can touch this question. I don't think there are many experts who would be better than Afonso. But today, Afonso will be leading us. He will make an introductory word about the international humanitarian law, and then will elaborate on this topic in our follow-up sessions in July and in August. That's why I would like to extend my gratitude to Afonso for his openness to give these lectures. And I also express my gratitude to all the participants, because I know that to spend 90 minutes of our precious life on these lectures is a kind of commitment. It requires some kind of sacrifice, and I'm grateful for this to you. I'm sure it will help you to analyze this conflict better. So at this moment, I will cease speaking, and now I pass the floor to Afonso. Please, the floor is yours.
So let's see. So thank you very much for that presentation. I think you will acknowledge that probably I needed 25% of discount regarding what Pavlo has said. He was extremely kind, but it's true that my background is both in theology and philosophy and in international law. And I'm very happy to be here and to help in any way I can to understand this period, a very dark period of the history of humankind. So I divided, since Pavlo asked me for 3 lectures, I divided the 3 lectures regarding the topics of international law that I think that are more important to understand this conflict. And basically today we're going to look at the laws of the use of force. So how the international community regulates the use of force. And we're going to look especially to the different speeches that have been presented by different heads of state from Russia when it qualifies the war in Ukraine as a special military operation. What does that mean? Or when the majority of states talk about the invasion of Ukraine, what are the heads of state looking at when they say the invasion of Ukraine? And thirdly, when the United Nations start using the term of aggression. All these terms are terms from international law, and I understand that lay people or people that are not so familiar with international law, maybe these terms sound like the same thing, but they are not. So I will try to make the legal speech understandable. And then we're going to look precisely of what we think and know that is motivating President Putin for this war. And I think Pavlo is right. By the way, Pavlo, your Ukrainian is beautiful. You have a perfect accent and your grammar is excellent. But just to also to acknowledge what seems to be the foundation for this war from the Mr. Putin's perspective and his philosophical foundations for this war. And then we're going to look to the United Nations Charter and how the international community after the Second World War has been regulating the use of force. Then the second class or lecture, we're going to look to international humanitarian law, which are the laws of war. So how, once a conflict begins, what are the laws that you apply on the battlefield? So who is who, the principle of distinction, who is a combatant, who is a civilian, which looking to what can be a military target and what can be a civilian target, and the rules and the weapons that can be used during the conflict. Actually, as you know, Russia has been deployed already 6 supersonic drones, which is already some kind of an autonomous system. So we can dig into considerations about the weaponry that is also being used and the help that third states are giving to Ukraine military forces. The third and last lecture, if you survive to my third lecture, is about international criminal law. So we're going to look why it is so important to call this war as a war of aggression. It has direct implications in international criminal law, and about the initiatives that were taken by some states or by some private people that tried to promote a special court for the crime of aggression committed in Ukraine by Russia, or the lack of legitimacy or jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for this specific case. And with that, I think that we can have more or less a good perspective of what this conflict entails in terms of international law. First, the use of force. Second, laws of war. And third, international criminal law. So, of course, in international criminal law, we're going to look to the problems of accountability. I tend to say jokes, and because the law can sound very dry, I hope it's not this afternoon, but please, if you have any difficulty, just raise your hand or ask me questions whenever you want, because I know that this can be, it can be hard, especially when you are emotionally directly involved in this conflict. And now I'm going to share my PowerPoint. So here we go, and where is my Is it possible to share my share screen? Of course it is. Here we go. It is share. So, is it possible to read it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Great. So just to give you a small introduction, I think that when we talk about international law and international institutions, and especially I find that among my students, and also 2 weeks ago, I was in an international conference that we were looking to the conflict in Ukraine, and there is by lay people, and lay people I mean not international lawyers, a kind of a sense of demotivation, or people feel despondent when they talk about international law, in the sense a conflict like this happens and we are watching the Ukrainian people being killed and the Ukrainian state being devastated, and what? At the end of the day, what is international law doing? And I'm not here to defend my dame international law, but just to explain that international law in somehow is a very recent branch of international law. It was born after the Second World War. And we can say that the United Nations Charter has an obsession. And the obsession of the United Nations Charter is to forbid the use of armed force. And at the same time to create an institution such as the Security Council, where you find the 5 permanent members that in somehow have the power to regulate what is going on and to qualify situations as threats to peace and international security. And when the Security Council qualifies a situation as an international threat to peace or international security, the Security Council can order, for instance, armed interventions. It's true that this seems very simple, but of course, as you know, the Security Council is organized with countries such as the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. And to put these 5 states together and to agree on something is quite a journey. And in the case of Ukraine, as you know, the Russian Federation at the time of the invasion was actually the presidency of the Security Council was trusted to the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation has vetoed any possible resolution that the Security Council tries to approve. Then, looking to the language used, so we have a special military operation is the language used by the Russian Federation. And looking to international law, when you talk about a special military operation, you are talking about military operations within your state. So here is when you, for instance, imagine that that a country has problems with terrorists and goes to a place where those terrorists are living and use force to kill or to arrest those terrorists. That is a special military operation, is the use of armed force within a territory of a state. So when President Putin uses this language, he clearly is rejecting the sovereignty of the state or the independence of Ukraine. It's not just Ukraine, as you know, that is rejecting the independence. Yesterday, President Putin gave a conference or an interview on a Russian channel that arrived to me by a Russian colleague that is suffering a lot, of course, because he's Russian and he's watching his country doing these kind of things. But President Putin was also questioning the sovereignty of Sweden, because according to President Putin, Peter the Great was the one who conquered Sweden to the Russian country. So it would be a history mistake to say that Sweden is an independent and sovereign country, because if we look to the history, Sweden would be part of Russia. So President Putin, I think that he will exclude Africa, but for President Putin at the moment, I think that the entire Europe it will be part of this Russian empire for looking at the language that President Putin is using. Then some other states prefer the language of invasion. Invasion is when a state used the language of invasion is clearly looking at the violation of the principle of prohibition of use of force. So an invasion is the first example of the violation of the use of force. And thirdly, when some heads of state, for instance, the UK and some members at the General Assembly at the UN are talking about aggression. And what is the difference? Aggression is the most serious and grave use of force. So it's not just the violation of the principle of prohibition of use of force, but it is, the maximum violation. And when we talk about aggression, we talk about immediately of the crime of aggression. That is, the head of state that pursues a war of aggression is automatically criminally responsible for a crime of aggression. So the states that are qualifying the war in Ukraine as an aggression, they are not just looking to the violation of the principle of the prohibition of use of force, but they are looking automatically to the future of accountability. So now, looking to President Putin and to what I have been studying about President Putin and this dramatic change in his speech from 2010 to 2012. So it's a fact that during the period of 2000 and 2008, Russia made a tremendous economic progress. And in somehow until 2008, actually, President Putin was very close to Europe. And also, even in some negotiations, he approved the possible membership of the Ukraine to the European Union. Sorry. Oh, okay. And actually, President Putin, in a speech to the European Parliament, tried also to extend Europe to Russia in terms of economic agreements, etc. In 2008, as you probably know better than I do, there was a kind of a dance. It's more an Argentinian tango between President Medvedev and Mr. Putin. And both of them, they would play with the chairs. When one was the prime minister, the other would be the president, then the other, and they would turn their positions. Well, I have a question here. Sorry. Oops. Oh, it's in Russian. It's in Ukrainian. I'm so sorry. Okay. Am I doing something wrong?
I think it's okay. Continue.
Can I continue? Okay. And basically, why is this important? Because President Putin was able to rearrange the constitutional system of Russia to be elected for a third term to a fourth term in violation of what the Russian constitution said at the beginning, that the president could only be present for 2 terms. And so we have this new chapter in the Russian history, that we have a president becoming a kind of a perpetual leader of the country. At the same time, Mr. Putin discovers a former Russian philosopher, very well or very poorly known in Europe, called Ivan Ilyin. He was a nobleman that saw his family being killed by the Russian Revolution in 1917. He escaped to Switzerland. He did his PhD in Austria. And he became a professor at the University of Philosophy in Austria. And basically, why is this philosopher so important? it's so important that in 2012, President Putin ordered that this philosopher became part of the mandatory program of every high school in Russia. And there is no decision of the Constitutional Court of Russia that the president of the court does not quote Ivan Ilyin. So in philosophical terms, I'm finding very enlightening to know this philosopher, and also to help me understand who is this man called Vladimir Putin. So basically, this man is the founder of a new and modern form of fascism, and a white fascism. So, and basically he had a vision that God made a terrible sin when he created the humankind. Because, of course, it doesn't talk about God in Christian terms, it's talking about God in philosophical terms. So God as the Almighty created man, and he destroyed his totality. And the only country that was protected from liberal ways of living and sinful ways of living was Russia. So this Ivan Ilyin compares Russia to the Immaculate Conception, and Russia, by special design of God, was preserved of this sinful condition. And Ilyin said that the future of Russia would be to wait for a leader that would be able to reject his own family and his own people in order to promote the Russian civilization. So Mr. Putin gave an interview in 2010 that he quotes Ivan Ilyin almost at least 5 times during the interview. And then Ivan Ilyin became as a mandatory philosopher to be studied in Russia. And if you look to the modern philosophers in Russia, they all talk about Ivan Ilyin. Also, Mr. Putin has the support of the Orthodox Church, especially by his very close friend, this Orthodox monk, Shekunov. I'm sorry, probably my pronunciation is terrible, but that not only this monk is responsible for the spread of the work of Ilyin for the salvation of Russia, as he spreads that actually President Putin is this new leader, kind of new messiah for the Russian civilization. And then we have Gumilyev, but nowadays a current very close friend to Mr. Putin, which is Prokhshanov, that precisely created this concept of Eurasia. So Mr. Putin gives a speech to the European Union in 2014 saying that he doesn't believe in the European Union. He wants distance from the ways of the European Union. He uses all the discourse that probably you are more familiar than I am, that of gay marriage and gay parties and gay men and all the problems of pornography and so on, as a symbol of the degradation of the Western world. And Gumilyev creates this concept of Eurasia that now is developed by other Russian philosophers. That means the expansion or the exportation of the Russian values to the rest of the world. And the first thing of this project, as these philosophers that created a special group of oligarchs and philosophers called the Izborg Club, that gather and create the principles. And one of the first principles is that Russia needs to restore its territorial integrity as it was in the former Russian Empire. And so what the years of the 90s, when the end of the former Soviet Union, is a date to forget for the Russians. So all the Baltic countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and so on, it's a Russian nightmare how these former states became independent from Mother Russia. And so if you listen to the last interviews of President Putin and you have this philosophical discourse in mind, you start understanding why Mr. Putin questions the independence of Sweden and threats everybody, because this is what President Putin believes, or he wants to believe. So, just to give you a philosophical background, and now we're going to move to what I wanted to say today. So basically, in the United Nations Charter has a very important article, which is Article 2.4. And probably in every article in New York Times or that talk about the laws of the use of force, they talk about the famous Article 2.3, 2.4, and 2.7. So Article 2.3 says that any state that has a conflict with another state needs to solve the conflict using peaceful measures. Article 2.4 is going to establish the principle of the prohibition of armed force. So no state member of the United Nations can solve a conflict using armed force that puts at stake the territorial and political independence of a state. And then the Article 2.7 is the principle of the sovereignty of domestic affairs. So no state is allowed to interfere in the domestic affairs of another state. So, you know, this is like the Bible of international law. The Article 2.4 is so important that when we talk about aggression, as I said, is the most serious form of violation of the principle of prohibition of use of force, we have also this resolution that sometimes is very much quoted even in newspapers, the resolution 3314, that it says that any violation of the Article 2.4 is also an act of aggression. And then just to see how important this is, in a very famous case, Nicaragua versus United States from the 80s, although the judgment is almost from the 90s, the court decided that the principle of prohibition of use of force not only would be a fundamental norm of international law, as would be a norm of jus cogens. And what does that mean? A norm of jus cogens is an imperative norm of international law, recognized and accepted by all members of the international community, that cannot face any derogation. So, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the importance of the principle of the prohibition of use of force. And that principle cannot be violated by anyone. Okay, then we have two exceptions to this principle. One exception is when the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter identifies a situation of threat to peace or international security. For instance, so all the armed interventions that the Security Council authorized, for instance, in African countries. So this would be an exception, but is authorized by the Security Council because the Security Council identified a situation of threat and to peace and international security. As you know, on the 26th of February of this year, the Security Council met to approve a resolution against the intervention of Russia in Ukraine, and was precisely a resolution where the Security Council wanted to declare the situation in Ukraine as a threat to peace and international security. And as you probably know, Russia was the only country to veto this resolution. Why it would be so important for Russia to approve, or why this resolution would be so important? Because it leads us to the second exception. When the Security Council identifies a situation of threat or threat to peace and international security, or a state is victim of an armed attack, so a violation of Article 2.4, the state is entitled to self-defense. So if the Security Council would approve the resolution, the international community, so all states, had to obey that resolution of the Security Council and use the measures that the Security Council would order for the conflict in Ukraine. So if the Security Council, for example, would decide that it was a situation of threat to peace and international security and would recognize the right of collective self-defense, all the states presented at the General Assembly had the duty to collaborate with Ukraine and to assist with armed force to Ukraine. But that resolution didn't pass. Actually, it's very sad to see that even in 2014, when Crimea was invaded, the resolution in the General Assembly, not at the level of the Security Council, but the General Assembly didn't also qualify the invasion in Ukraine as a threat to peace and international security, or it didn't make any special recommendations to the Security Council. So I think that in somehow to justify this huge concern about the situation in Ukraine is also proper of some sense of guilt of the European Union and from the international community, because actually Crimea was invaded and annexed to the Russian territory, and the international community watched it happen and didn't qualify that as a serious violation of the principle of prohibition of use of force. So at the end of the day, what happens? It happens that Ukraine is entitled to the right of self-defense against the invasion of Russia, because it was object of an armed attack, and because it was object of an aggression, and because when you have a violation of Article 2.4, the state is able to exercise its right of self-defense. Now, what happens? Does Ukraine have enough weaponry or forces on the ground to deal with an army such as the Russian army? Yes and no. I think in terms of facilities and weaponry and soldiers, it's fair to recognize that Ukraine by itself alone wouldn't have any possibility to dialogue with the Ukrainian invasion. However, what has surprised the world and has surprised for sure the Russian government is the resilience of the Ukrainian people. And it is, I think, is the first time in the history of the world, in modern history, that a president of a country called his own civilians to take arms and fight an army such as the Russian army. Then we're going to talk tomorrow about the complexity of this decision by President Zelensky. It's not without consequences to call civilians to take arms. But so, and there's two sides of the legitimate defense to the Ukrainian people: the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the lack of weaponry. And in that sense, President Zelensky, as you know better than I do, has asked the world to help Ukraine and also to declare a non-fly zone, as similar to what the UK, the United States, and France has declared in the war in Iraq in the 90s, so a non-fly zone. What is the problem? So first, President Zelensky, when he asked for help from the rest of the international community, that is what we call the collective system of self-defense. President Zelensky is entitled to do so, and the states are free to answer yes or no. So, and we know the countries that are helping Ukraine in terms of weaponry. What happens with a non-fly zone is that the non-fly zone is not what the majority of people think, that is just to forbid Russian aircraft to use the Ukrainian airspace. It's not. When you declare a non-flying zone, it means not only that Russian aircraft is not allowed to fly over the Ukrainian airspace, but it's also allowed to these states to confront directly military facilities in Russia. So it means that there would be a direct confrontation between the third states helping Ukraine, such as the UK, recently Germany, France, and the UK, also to target military facilities of Russia. And as you know, nobody in the world wants to get into a direct confrontation with Russia. Two reasons. First, Mr. Putin, since the beginning of, I think since 2012 or 2008, if we consider the invasion in Georgia, is in total disrespect for international law, and there is the serious threat of a nuclear war. And so when the United States approved in sending missile defensive systems to Ukraine of medium range, and they put a condition to President Zelensky. These systems cannot be used if they will pass to the Russian territory, because the United States does not want and will ever want a confrontation with Russia. And here is where the importance of the enemy is really important to consider, because we are not fighting a normal state, we are fighting a state as Russia and a permanent member of the Security Council. And so this becomes really difficult to deal with this question. Now, so to summarize what I wanted to say, because I think I'm exceeding my time. Am I?
Yes, feel free to finish.
Okay. So just to wrap up these conclusions, what do we have here? We have to look from the beginning. We have a president of the Russian Federation that is actually, he fell in love for this idea of the Russian civilization, and he sees in himself the new leader of Russia, the new Vladimir, the Russian hero. And then we have, looking to the international system, a severe violation of the rules of prohibition of use of force, and that Ukraine is entitled to its inherent right of self-defense, and within this right to ask for help to other members of the international community that they are giving. One consideration, of course, is the fact that nobody in the international community, or no state in the international community, wants a direct confrontation with the Russian army, except in Ukrainian territory, because that changed slightly the picture. And then, of course, we have also different reactions in the international community. We have, as you know, not a very well performance by Germany at the beginning of the conflict, and that explains by the trade negotiations that Russia has with Germany, but it is changing quite a lot. And then we have France and the United States as the main supporters of the Ukrainian cause, together with the international community, but these are clearly the most important countries. And with this, I would conclude and ready for your question. I'm sorry if I was too boring, but I just want to give you a sense of what international law says.
Yes, thank you very much, Afonso. Do you want to stop maybe sharing your screen?
Sure.
Yeah, so we can...
Sure, if I knew, oh, yeah, here we go.
Okay. Wonderful. So please feel, будь ласка, прошу задавайте ваші питання, ви можете підняти руку.
Now, please, you're welcome to ask questions. You can do this by raising your hand, raising your arm, or pressing on the special reaction raise arm. Or you can write your questions in the chat, and then either me or our interpreter will translate. I can see the first question from Christina Teplova. Just formulate your question very slowly so that our interpreter would be able to translate. Christina, you cannot unmute yourself. Okay, now go ahead. Thank you. Hello. Tell us, please, how can we deprive Putin in his membership or the membership of his country in the Security Council?
Right. Shall I receive a couple of questions, or do you prefer to answer each question? Pavlo, what?
As you prefer, Afonso.
I can answer this one.
Okay, do answer.
Right. So this is the $1 million question, in the sense that Russia has been expelled already from the Human Rights Council, the European Council, and of course, to expel Russia from the United Nations Charter means basically to destroy the entire system that was built after the Second World War. And of course, no state will suggest that. However, I think that the European community and also the United States are so concerned with this event of the war in Ukraine that the floor of impossibilities is reducing. So if I would consider that this would be totally impossible to think in expelling Russia from the Security Council, I think as things are being developing, I wouldn't take it out of the table, but that would represent a destruction or rebuilding the entire system of international security without a member such as Russia. And I'm not sure if the international community wants that, if I answer your question. The next question, Stephen, is it?
Yes, it's Stephen. So am I audible? Can you hear me?
Pardon?
Yes, we can, Stephen. Go on. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, one, on the perspectives of different nations supporting Ukraine in terms of weaponry. I would just want to hear your opinion, Father Afonso, about the
weapons.
In weapons, yeah, about the role of proxies in terms of sustained peace, or will it take much longer? Because in Africa, we are expressing issues on high food costs, which we believe we import more, or Ukraine exports more. So at the long run, so what's the long run of proxies in war? Because I assume that it's making some enemies also. for those who are supporting.
But when you talk about proxy war, are you talking about the cyber attacks?
Yeah, I'm just talking about not only cyber attacks, because there's accusations from Russia that there's proxies, maybe some countries supporting Ukraine, which is okay on a positive note. So what is your opinion on that?
Right. So if I'll try to answer the question if I understood it entirely. So it's impossible to make a war without weapons. That is the reality of things. And actually, people ask me all the time, how can a priest study autonomous weapons? Well, the only way of destroying an enemy is to study it thoroughly. So it's true that all the weapons that have been used by Russia are allowed under international law, except the supersonic missiles, dash drones that Russia used. I'm not talking about the quality of the attacks, because that is a question for the next lecture. I'm talking about the weapons. So the weapons are allowed. The way that Russia is using them is a completely different story, and we're going to see under the laws of war. It's true that Russia is using cyber technology, so attacks made by computers against networks of other states. I was myself victim of a cyber attack by Russia in my computer while I was in the United States, because I work for an American agency, so the North American agency to geospatial control. So we were under the eyes of the Russian government. So what I think is that the cyber technology and the weapons that are being used, cyber is just a new weapon proper of the modern times, that everybody moves in the technology of internet and so on. So it's a kind of hidden warfare. It's very difficult to locate who is the aggressor, but in terms of effects, a cyber attack can have as severe consequences as a normal weapon can have. But that raises other issues. In terms of weapons that Russia is using, until today, we could question the supersonic missiles, but Russia in that area is respecting international law. Until the moment, they are not using weapons that are forbidden by international law. However, it's true that the international community of the Red Cross has identified some evidence of cluster munitions. So cluster munitions are forbidden under international law, but Russia has not ratified that treaty. So that prohibition does not apply to the Russian armed forces. So, is what I can say in terms of weapons.
Yes, there was a precision question about the chemical weapons.
Oh, the
хімічна зброя, так, і боєприпаси з фосфором. Це ж...
And also phosphorus ammunition. And
Right.
then I will pass on to the questions from Christina and others.
Mm-hmm. So regarding the chemical weapons, and it is a weapon that was used also by the United States in the latest war in Afghanistan. So one thing is chemical weapons, another thing is the phosphorus weapons, and they are not equivalent. Of course, we could question the phosphorus weapons not only by the consequences that they have, because they create what we call in the laws of war. So this is a proper laws of war. That is the reason I was preventing of talking today, but well, never mind. Because they cause unnecessary suffering in the combatants. So they in a true logic of international law, they are forbidden weapons. And of course, nuclear weapons are totally forbidden, and Russia is threatening other countries with nuclear attacks. And sometimes I think we expect too much from international law, in the sense, for instance, any single state in the world has criminal law. A state that has criminal law is acknowledging at the same time that crimes are committed. And so the reason is to create the reason for the creation of international for criminal law. And in international law, the situation is even worse, because you have the sovereign states, and the states are the main and more important actor in the international society. And if a state decides to violate these norms, a country such as Russia, it becomes very difficult to deal with these problems. However, I have to say that the response of the international community is quite new. I think since 1945, we never seen the world so united against another country. And I think we will have a second war in Ukraine, but I won't talk about that now. Okay.
Дякую, Афонсо. Христино, що ви хотіли ще питання, чи то вас рука?
Thank you, Alfonso. Christina, would you like to ask another question, or is this just the hand that is still remaining from the first question?
Довести агресію Росії.
Please, how can we prove aggression of Russia if it's member of the Security Council? So does it mean that this aggression has to be recognized by Putin?
Right, great question. If you were my student, you had lots of points. So the situation of aggression is recognized by every single individual state. So the heads of state are responsible to say if according to their understanding of international law, if the war in Ukraine is an act of aggression by Russia. So in that sense, 123 states referred the situation to the International Criminal Court as being an act of aggression. So it's the recognition of an act of aggression is always by the other states. Of course, Russia, according to Mr. Putin, they are the holy men, the saviors of the future international community. So of course, we cannot wait for that recognition by President Putin, but is recognized by other states. Another problem is the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over the crime of aggression regarding Russia, and because Russia is not a party of the ICC statute, and that is the reason that so many academics, and I was involved in that project at the beginning with the Ukrainian foreign minister in the first meeting, to create a special court for aggression in Ukraine. So, and that, of course, is the recognition by the international community in its whole that a war of aggression is being committed in Ukraine, and that people and the heads of state and all the entourage surrounding Mr. Putin needs to be held accountable for the crime of aggression. But it does not depend, and it's not necessary for Mr. Putin to recognize a war of aggression, because he won't ever do that.
Дуже дякую. Олександро Коваленко, будь ласка.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kovalenko.
Вам зручно, так.
Can I ask a question in English?
at the end of your presentation, you said about that no country wants to confront directly Russia, and that's the reason why they're not given the weapons that can reach the Russian territory. So I wanted to clarify, is it the problem with that Russia will just interpret, like if these weapons are used by Ukrainian military, the problem is that Russia will interpret as a direct aggression, or like if looking from the point of view of the international law, it will mean that the other country attacked Russia, and what can be the consequences of such uses of weapons. So to be like, to put it simple, what are other countries afraid of? That Russia will shoot their territory straight away? Because I think everyone understands that if Ukrainian military has not enough powers to stop Russia at our borders, it will eventually go to other countries. So what consequences can be, and how we look at it from this point of view of the international law? Thank you.
I don't know if you have studied law or all these questions, but
no, I'm a religious studies scholar.
But they are all very good. That is an excellent and question, but also very difficult to answer. But from my perspective, there is a prohibition of using of nuclear weapons, which is not a total prohibition because of a decision of the International Court of Justice in that matter. But it's true that we have 7 countries in the world that have nuclear weapons, and Russia is one of them. So the problem is that the possible confrontation with Russia, even if it wasn't with nuclear weapons, the danger of a nuclear war would be imminent. As Russia is, for instance, when Russia starts threatening other countries, if they would give any military support to Ukraine, of course, Russia doesn't want a nuclear war as well. And because he's watching now Germany and UK and France and other countries giving weaponry to Ukraine, and Russia hasn't done anything except suspending natural gas now to add Germany to his first list. So the problem is that, because weapons is my area of intervention, more autonomous system, but people are very keen to why are we so scared about a nuclear war? Because we look to the nuclear weapons as we look to the Second World War. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, they suffered a nuclear bomb, but the nuclear bombs that were made at the time are less aggressive than the nuclear weapons that we have today. And actually, you can have also, Russia has the capacity to introduce a nuclear biological war, for instance, contaminating the natural gas or waters that go to other countries. So it's, normally I explain this to my students, I hope I don't offend anyone, is how the son-in-law deals with the mother-in-law. And is not killing the mother-in-law, is how to, this very difficult dance of fight of powers. And at the moment, Mr. Putin has rejected any kind of negotiation. And I think it's not because I'm Portuguese, it's I think the worst thing that Mr. Putin did that really scared the international community was when the Secretary General of the United Nations, so Antonio Guterres, has visited President Putin in Moscow, and at the same time that he was visiting Moscow, he started a very heavy bombardment of important cities in Ukraine. This is a total disrespect even for the institution of the United Nations. And so you say, so expel Russia. Expelling Russia wouldn't do anything. It would make Putin even more furious to get more support for his own population that lives in the world of ignorance and completely blocked from external information. And so that is a point. The other point is that it's true that we are receiving fake news from both sides. And so that is why it's so important that the heads of state like President Macron and so on have visited Kyiv to see what is going on, and the Secretary General and also the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, because we need to gather reliable evidence. And there is also evidence of war crimes committed by Ukrainian troops. So the balance is very difficult, but this is more or less what I wanted to say.
Окей, я зараз прочитаю кілька питань з чату і потім...
I will read out loud now a couple of questions from the chat, and then I will pass on to the people who are live, who are asking questions live. There is a question from Hanna Kulagina Stahnichenko. Which reasons could be sorry, I don't. Shall it be what reason could be for the other countries to support Ukraine? Should it be only direct aggression from the side of Russia? So what can cause direct support of Ukraine with weapons from the side of Western countries? What? And probably this question has two components: the legal, what will provide legal basis for other countries to join a war in Ukraine, and probably it has geopolitical component. Afonso?
Right. Okay. Thank you for the question. So basically, the reason for any state to support Ukraine with weapons is what we call, I think I explained this, but is what we call the right of collective self-defense of Ukraine. So Ukraine, the President Zelensky has the authority and the right, according to international law, to ask for help from third states. So every single state is entitled, not only European countries, but other countries in the world are entitled to support the war in to fight for Ukraine, sending weapons. If, however, military forces like soldiers, imagine soldiers from Germany, for instance, or from France, would join Ukrainian troops, this would become a conflict not only between Russia and Ukraine, but also between Russia, Ukraine, and Germany. So that is the reason why the countries at the moment are only supporting with weapons. Because at this moment, the international community is trying to avoid a Second World War or a Third World War. Because there is another thing, so if I'm allowed to, so Russia is doing in Ukraine what Russia did in Georgia. When Russia understands that is losing a conflict, the traditional military strategy of Russia is to completely destroy a country, to ruin its possibility of economic growth, and then they go back to their own country. So basically, this objective was almost concluded when Russia was able to conquer all the area of Donbass and to block Ukraine to the Black Sea. But as I said at the beginning, the Ukrainian army, with the support also of weaponry from other countries, is able to fight back that Russia never rests. So the Russians are still there, and we know with the daily budget of $2 billion per day that Russia is spending in the war in Ukraine. So why do I think we're going to have a second war? And maybe you're going to tell me that I'm wrong, I'm entitled to be wrong. What will be the second war that Europe is preparing for? Is that this war someday will end. In the sense the military, the troops from Russia will retreat, Ukraine probably will left in a bad state, the European countries and the United States will support economically Ukraine, as we have seen until now, but then we have a second war. And the second war is when the Ukrainian people will start returning to Ukraine. And look into the history of Ukraine and features of the Ukrainian people. I think Europe, or at least among some countries, there is this concern that the Ukrainian people won't rest until they recover their country. And that is the kind of war that the European Union can participate when Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union. And that is the reason why it's so important for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union, because under the Charter of the European Union, all the members of the EU are obliged to fight against Russia. But as from the moment that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union, the European armies will need to fight for Ukraine. And as I believe that the Ukrainian people won't rest until they recover parts of the territory, there will be a second war. And so I think that is one of the reasons why the direct involvement of European armies doesn't exist before, first because it's forbidden under the European Charter. Under the United Nations Charter, it's also forbidden because there is no resolution of the Security Council. And so they are participating with weapons because it's what collective self-defense authorizes. And there is here a question that is addressed to me as a priest. Regarding, I think it's an interesting question, so I'm disobeying Pamlo and I'm going to answer this one. So the question says, how do you think what can lead a person to mass murderers, including children? I think this is the tricky question, isn't it? How can Mr. Putin go to bed every night knowing that he's killing thousands of people, creating millions of refugees, and also deaths among his own people? So how can he sleep? You know, there's lots of psychological explanations and also philosophical explanations. Sigmund Bauman, a German philosopher, talks about the banality of evil. So, but you know, we have these examples around the world. We have in North Korea, we have in India, we have in the Philippines, we have in Russia, we have in Brazil, we have President Trump in the United States. There is this sense that we are losing track of history, that the world is becoming a dirty place and that needs salvation. And so these people pretend to be the new saviors. And so I believe that at the beginning, I couldn't accept it, but now after all this war and reading what Mr. Putin says and so on, and an article that he published in 2012, the way he talks about Ukraine and so on, I think really that he's convinced that are good deaths, in the sense they are good deaths to achieve this Eurasia, this Russian civilization. And so it's all justified. For instance, when he reads Ilyin, when Ilyin says that the leader needs to reject his own family, is when actually Mr. Putin gets divorced. So I think he you know, yeah. Okay. Another question.
Дякую, Афонсо. У нас є тоді два питання.
Thank you, Afonso. We have two more questions. People raised hands, and there are two more questions in the chat. So we have 4 questions pending and less than 10 minutes. So let's take all of these questions.
Okay.
And then you will select, or maybe you will answer all of them at once. Mr. Pasechnik, please. I have the following question. In fact, Russia has destroyed the existing system of security in the world. So now we have on the agenda a reform of United Nations. Do you think these reforms are possible, realistic? Can they at least exclude the aggressor from the United Nations? Or maybe at least somehow do not allow such country to be in the presidency, be it the United States or Russia or any other country. If the country is involved in that conflict, how can we make that this country does not have the right of veto? Because if we don't do this, then this means that the world is going to the Third World War. That we are on the brink of having this war in Europe. So what mechanisms can be applied? Or you think it's unrealistic and this reform will come only after the outbreak of the Third World War? Thank you. Thank you very much. Then I take a question from Christina, and then I will read the 2 questions from the chat. Christina, the floor is yours. Thank you. Tell us, please, why the international humanitarian law did not envisage the following. What if Putin dies? Who will become next the member of the Security Council? Thank you. Thank you, Christina, and 2 more questions from the chat. The first question is from Hanna Kulayina-Stednichenko about sanctions. When shall we expect the biggest efficiency of prices for Russia, and will it impact the course of war? That's question number 1. And the second question from Volodymyr Mykolaievich Yeremenko. Within the territory of Ukraine, there is 1/3 of the world, of the global black soil. So will the world allow Putin apply his nasty weapon to destroy this black soil? So we have 3 questions, in fact, with Mr. Pasechnik and Christina about United Nations. Is the United Nations reform possible? Can we take Russia away from the Security Council and other international bodies? And Christina asked who will be next after Putin sitting in the Security Council. It's 2 questions in one. Then the question about sanctions. When will they become tangible and efficient, and will they impact the course of war? And the third question about the black soil. So the black soil is a treasure for the whole humankind. It's significant for nutrition, for food supply. Can it be an argument to stop the possibility of forthcoming famine in Asia, Africa, and many other countries?
Okay. Each of the questions is a universe in itself, but I will try to answer as quick as I can in order to cover all the questions. So the first question regarding the reform of the United Nations. I think the person who was asking the question asked the question in a very clever way, because Russia in somehow is destroying the international system. So why don't we rebuild a system without this aggressor? So there is an important distinction here, is between the country, the state, and the president of the state. So Russia is a member of the Security Council, whoever is the president. Another thing, and when we talk about crime of aggression, is not a crime of aggression committed by Russia Federation, but a crime of aggression committed by Mr. Putin and his more close advisors. So one thing is to punish a country, another thing is to punish the leader. And so what I think that will happen is, imagine that there is a coup in Russia and Mr. Putin stops being the president, and a new president, completely different, becomes the president of Russia. So would we admit Russia again because of the importance that Russia has in the world? So in terms of the in terms of the Security Council and the United Nations Charter, is the state that is a member. Then sanctions applied to the states, as it happens, for instance, Myanmar was object of sanctions by the General Assembly when the head of state does not comply with the values of democracy and respect of human rights, as North Korea also has faced sanctions and being expelled of some mechanisms of the United Nations. But to hope to Russia to be expelled of the Security Council, I think that is far-fetched at this moment, in the sense that the state is the member of the Security Council, and we need to distinguish the state from the person. Another thing is, in terms of European institutions, that the form to punish heads of state is to punish the state. And so Russia can be expelled of some mechanisms, but that does not happen at the level of the United Nations Charter. Then, regarding the sanctions, well, I think the world is under sanctions because of this war, because in every single country, and I think Ukraine must be the most terrible example at the moment, is the rise of prices in every single country in the world. So, for instance, in Portugal, which is a more dependent economy on the international trade, the petrol has raised already 4 times. It's the country with the more expensive fuel in Europe at the moment. So everybody is facing the consequences of this war. And what about Russia? Well, Russia has 2 allies in this war that are very happy with this war. One is India, the other one is China. So China and India had always difficulty in fuel and in natural gas. And Russia, because Russia was a huge supplier of the rest of the world in natural gas, Russia had a very small storage of natural gas and fuel to sell to India and to China. But now what happens is quite the opposite. Russia has too much natural gas, and too much fuel. So is selling at lower prices to China and to India. And so this injection of daily money, that is millions of millions in the Russian economy, is helping Russia to survive. Until when, we do not know, or at least I don't know. But I think it's really very, for instance, it's true that that Russia was spending $2 billion per day with its troops and weaponry and so on in the war in Ukraine. But if you look what Russia was receiving from Germany alone from the natural gas supplies, would cover that expenses. So Russia has a tremendous economy, although its reserves are frozen in Switzerland. So how this is going to target the Russian people, I'm not an economist and I don't deal with these problems. So I think at the moment is more the rest of the international community that is paying a very high price. And the second thing, I think that will be the sanction of Russia, is that Russia, to recover the trust of the international community, Russia will have to prove a lot. And the reason also to have Russia in the Security Council is a way of controlling Russia, because Russia will have all its petitions refused for years and years. So it's a long crisis that Russia will endure, because even if Mr. Putin disappears because he dies or because there is a coup or something, before Russia recovers the international trust, and believe me, that countries such as the UK, Germany, France, and other countries in Europe will make Russia pay for what their economies are facing at the moment. So that is for sure, because this won't last forever. And India is already under pressure, and China as well, from the United States. So we need to see how this goes. Then the third question was about, oh God.
It was about the fertile soil of the southern part of Ukraine, which allows Ukraine to produce, yes, an important part of wheat and food, which is then being shipped to entire world. Whether this argument can be an additional argument to stop Russia, because by occupying, they block, yes, cultivation of soil and also the ports which deliver grain to various countries. Is this not like a danger, a threat of food shortages around the world, and thus would motivate international community to stop Russia, also military?
Yes. So a quick answer, yes. Long answer, it's true that there is an advantage for Ukraine regarding this war, is that I don't know if you are familiar, but Ukraine is known in Europe and has been known in Europe for years and years as the bread of Europe. So even for instance, in Portugal, that is also well, comparing with Ukraine, we are nothing but a big producer of cereals. And Ukraine was the main exporter of cereals next to Russia, to the rest of the world. So it's impossible for Europe to survive without the wheat and the cereals coming from Ukraine. And as you know, the president of the European Commission is dialoguing with Russia and Ukraine to create corridors to have the wheat arriving to the world. And last Wednesday, 18,000 tons of wheat and grain arrived to Spain to be distributed. So if this corridor is allowed, of course, it's a big victory for the European Union, and it means in somehow some kind of retreat from the Russian troops. Regarding the soil, of course, the European Union at this moment is very much involved and stressing as much as the European Union can for that reservation, because Ukraine is called the bread of Europe, to be preserved of any kind of attack. But we are dealing with an unpredictable man as Mr. Putin. So there is a part of the question that I really do not know, but that at the moment, the European Union is scared of starvation, not to speak about some African countries that depend very much on the grain coming from Ukraine as well and from Russia, but because of the decisions that some African countries took in the General Assembly against Russia, Russia stopped sending grain as well for those countries. So problem of starvation in Europe and starvation in African countries is a real threat and a real problem. And so I think that at the moment, all the leaders are very much concerned to preserve as they can Ukraine. but we are dealing with an unreasonable and unpredictable man as Mr. Putin. So there is a part that, it's impossible to answer.
Дуже дякую, Afonso.
Thank you very much, Afonso, for your lecture and for your answers. Indeed, some notions you have distributed onto different shelves. We have not touched upon many notions yet, though we will come back to them during our next trainings. Please secure the dates 27th of July and the 9th of August at 9 o'clock, at 18 p.m., at 6 p.m. We will look at the questions of war. What's the difference between soldiers, combatants, and civilians? We will also have a look at the status of prisoners of war. What rights do they have? How they should be treated? Then we will deal with weapons, which weapons is allowed and which is not. Then on the 9th of August, we will have a look at what chances has Ukraine in the International Court of Justice? What are the chances to apply the Convention on Genocide to our war? And we shall also have a look at these legal issues. I also want to express gratitude to everyone who enabled, who made this meeting possible, to the Konrad Adenauer Fund, to their office based in Ukraine for their support. I want to extend my gratitude to Irina Kitura, who was coordinating this event. Without her engagement, we wouldn't be able to have this meeting. I want to extend gratitude to Marta Bilska for media, accompanying to Oleg for transmitting this event. Thanks goes to our interpreter, Helena Pastushuk, who was also enabled simultaneous interpretation. So let's applaud to everyone. I express gratitude to everyone, starting from Afonso and finishing with Irina and all the rest that I have mentioned. Thank you for your interest in this event, for attending it. Perhaps it's difficult for us to perceive all this information because it has a lot of legal terms and it's a very precision-based information. Thank you for explaining all this to us in a very understandable language. Thank you and hope to see you next time.